Bonjour, Wache Anin, Tansi. Welcome to Lakehead University. Denise Baxter and Tishnakas, Makwa Dodem, Martin Falls and Donjaba. It's my pleasure to invite Elder Ron Linklater to say an opening prayer. Welcome.
Miigwech, Denise. Good to talk with Denise and be here in a good way with people that I recognize, people that are very important to the institution, and of course, people that live in this province. We want to celebrate and recognize what we're about to hear and what we can inform other people about as citizens of Ontario. Anin, bonjour, Nichiwag, and Dana Kabin, the old people, Ron Linkler and Nishnakaz, Atik in Dugo, and Nene and Dugo, Atik in Totem, Kuchiching and Donji, Wikwe Dong and Namki and Daya Nungum, Nameno and Dem Jubiganonagok. Nga Namiya, I will pray. Miigwech da, Nanakama da, Gijemanado. Chuichi Yang Gakana, Gedenoe Makanak, Menoya Wat, Minando, Menopamatazi Win. Juanimishanam, Gijemanido, Gigitama Gizimin, Juanimishanam, 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 Aho. And that comes from the language that the original people from the area would have talked, and that is one of, I always tell people, that's one of our oldest continuous non-stop languages on earth. So we are very blessed to know the language, to learn the language, but to incorporate the language in your understanding what you're about to hear this morning from our speakers. And just preparing to come here, I was reading about the 1763 proclamation. It was about 297 years later I was born in 1960, 297 years later. And I didn't know about the Royal Proclamation. We didn't talk about that in the schools that I went to. People were not given that information to know about that history of what made this nation what it is and this continent what it's about, and the relationships the newcomers had with the original people. Anishinaabe Mwin, our language, one of our words for treaties is referencing binding together, a treaty, in treaties, plural. And that speaks to our beautiful concept of how we get along with human beings, and how we as Indigenous people got along with the newcomers. And that came from sacred law and ancient law. And this was never taught to Canadians. This was never taught to your grandparents, your great-grandparents. Your great-great-grandparents were never given this knowledge, this information. And yet it was there at the signing of the treaties and these agreements. And the treaties are still being developed. They're not going to stop. They'll continue being made and entered into as we continue on as a race of human beings in a good way. So with that, I know I'm very happy to look forward to hearing these amazing talkers and to share their knowledge in a good way. In our ceremonies, Opwagan is what we call a pipe, Opwagan. And some of the people that brought their pipes in 1763, those rocks came about 7 hours south of us, maybe even less, across the Medicine Line in Minnesota. These red rocked pipes, and they're sacred spirits in there. And in our language, Anishinaabe people have reference to the 7 grandfather teachings. One is about Debwe, which is about truth and about having faith, to be hopeful. And that's what that rock often can represent. So our people knew that. They were given these ancient laws to get along forever by using these grandfathers in their ceremonies. That's why we have those pipe bowls that when I was going to this institution in the early 80s, when I was going to call it a university here, I held these pipe bowls in my hands, 6,000 years old. 6,000 years old, just thinking, wow, somebody made this. Who made this? What was it about? And I was only to learn later about these teachings that were infused of why we have those pipes. So when I hold that rock in my hand, I'm holding faith, I'm holding hope, I'm holding truth in my hand. And that bowl comes with a stem. That stem, batig, comes from our tree. That tree grows straight and tall. It's about honesty. It's about debwe win, to tell the truth. And our ancestors put those two together. So when you smoke the pipe of peace, you hold truth and you hold faith in your hands forever. These are beautiful concepts that Canadians are just starting to embark on learning. And this is going to shape you for the rest of your lives as we form this country together in the future. Teach this to your children. Teach this to your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren. And we shouldn't, as I heard from a great chief who spoke here in the 1980s, he's gone now, but he says that's how we were ripped off. We didn't learn these. We should have learned this knowledge before, then we'd be able to speak in a good way, in a kind way, in a very intelligent way. So we have these blueprints to follow. And I want you to think of that in a good way as we begin the day. Ha, miigwech, aho.
Miigwech, Elder Ron, for your opening prayer, your words, your comments, and your teachings with us this morning. It is now my pleasure to introduce President Jillian Siddell to share welcoming remarks. Welcome.
Thank you, Denise. Thank you, Elder Ron. Every time you speak to us, it is so powerful and moving and beautiful. And I just love the way you share your language with us every time you speak. It's really powerful. And Denise, thank you for organizing this event. And good morning to everyone. Buju Washea Anin Tanshi, and welcome to this event that officially launches Lakehead University's Treaties Recognition Week 2023. Miigwech, Elder Ron Linklater, for opening us in a good way. I extend a welcome to all our guests and to all our speakers and to all who are watching us in Aurelia and elsewhere. Today, we have the honor to hear from Dr. Juan Sanchez Martinez with Dr. Hula Hughes on cross-cultural stories on treaties and futurities. I am honored to serve as the president of this university located on the traditional land of Fort William First Nation, as well as the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe. This annual event honors the importance of treaties. Its purpose is to help build awareness and teach us about the treaty relationships that exist between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, and of the importance of honoring the obligations made in those treaties. Treaties are legally binding agreements that set out the rights, responsibilities, and relationships of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, and Canada's federal and provincial governments. They provide a framework for how we will live together and share the land that Indigenous peoples have traditionally occupied. They also provide the pathway for ongoing cooperation and partnership as we move forward to advanced reconciliation. In Canada, we have historic treaties and modern treaties, also known as comprehensive land claim agreements, and they establish the foundation of the many relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. The Government of Canada recognizes 70 historic treaties signed between 1701 and 1923. Although many treaties were signed over a century ago, treaty commitments are just as valid today as they were then. At Lakehead University, one of the important steps we take in our firm commitment to reconciliation is our land acknowledgement for both our Thunder Bay and Aurelia campuses. We do this to acknowledge and honor the land which we reside on. It is important as settlers that we take the time to learn and understand the history of where we have built our communities and where our feet are planted. Lakehead University respectfully acknowledges its campuses are located on the traditional lands of Indigenous peoples. Lakehead Thunder Bay is located on the traditional lands of the Fort William First Nation, signatory to the Robinson Superior Treaty of 1850. Lakehead Aurelia is located on the traditional traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, covered by the Williams and Upper Canada Treaties. The Anishinaabe include the Ojibwe, Odawa, Potawatomi nations, collectively known as the Three Fires Confederacy. Lakehead University acknowledges the history that many nations hold in the areas around our campuses and is committed to a relationship with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples based on the principles of mutual trust, respect, reciprocity, and collaboration in the spirit of reconciliation. We are honored to have you all join us today. Miigwech, Marcy, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Denise, and thank you, Ron, for starting us out in a good way. I'm going to have to move this mic because between my old age glasses and my notes, I can't manage to have another thing that my eyes will suddenly decide they need to focus on. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much to the organizers. Thank you, Stacy, for making so much happen today. I want to say a few things about treaties in Canada before Juan takes us into a more global context. Over the next 10 minutes or so, I want to pursue two ideas. As a lawyer, I have to tell you, lawyers always talk in sets of three. So 2 means that I'm committed to keeping to my allotted time. The first idea I want to pursue is that learning about treaty is fundamentally a local exercise. And second, the idea that understanding treaties in 2023 also requires us to engage in the international and indeed global conversation about Indigenous rights. As we did today, most of our events that begin on our campuses here acknowledge the Robinson-Superior Treaty of 1850, and you heard the president mention that. Over the past few years, and I'm not going to put you on the spot, but if you were my students, I would say, how many of you, please put your hand up if you've ever read the Robinson-Superior Treaty of 1850. As I say, I'm not going to make this embarrassing to anybody, so just don't worry about it, but a few of you have and have proudly raised your hands, and I applaud you. Over the past few years, the Ontario courts have had an opportunity to engage quite deeply with the meaning of that particular treaty in order to learn what the treaty would have meant at the time that Treaty Commissioner Robinson traveled through Anishinaabe territories, seeking to secure to what would become the province of Ontario the ability to pursue natural resource economic development in the near north. In this context, the court heard extensively from Indigenous elders and knowledge keepers. This approach represented a significant departure from the ways courts in the past have sought to interpret historical treaties. Over much of the 20th century, the courts in Canada had denied any legal effect of treaties and declared them to be fundamentally a political type of accord that could be honored or breached at the discretion of the Crown. It's only beginning in the 1970s that courts became increasingly willing to legally enforce treaties. But they remained very focused on the text of the treaty and would only permit of what they thought of as context, where the treaty text appeared to them to be unclear or ambiguous. With the entrenchment of treaties in Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982, the courts became a much more regular venue for the interpretation and application of treaties. And the Supreme Court of Canada has generally required that the Indigenous perspective on the treaty should be considered. And this has allowed, subsequent to 1985, for more context about the history and the intentions of Indigenous peoples to come into the interpretive process of the courts. As a result, the most recent cases, including the one dealing with the Robinson treaties, are more hopeful for a meaningful implementation of treaties than the case law of the past. Much has been written in the academic literature about the unreliability of the treaty text in capturing appropriately the shared understanding of the treating parties at the time that the treaties were entered into. This is in part because treaties were typically expressed in English, translation was often not available, and there were significant cultural differences between the treating parties that were not always effectively bridged. In many cases, the treaties as expressed in the treaty text are also so manifestly unfair that it is difficult to imagine that the indigenous treaty partner would have accepted those terms had they actually been aware of them. In some ways, treaties require us to travel in time. We've already seen that interpreting and implementing treaties requires us to go back in time to find out what people meant to do at the time that the treaty was entered into. The Supreme Court of Canada has said that the goal or purpose of treaty interpretation is reconciliation in a particular understanding of that word. Reconciliation between indigenous sovereignties before the arrival of the Europeans and the assumption of crown sovereignty. And we could spend quite a bit of time unpacking what that means. But in the time we have, let me just say this. The fundamental problem that the Supreme Court of Canada is wrestling with here is that there is no theory of crown sovereignty outside of treaty. Outside of treaty, it's just might makes right. And that is not a very palatable solution in a country that imagines itself to be governed by the rule of law. So treaties then have two related promises in the Canadian legal context: the promise of the vindication of Indigenous rights and the promise of building a lawful foundation for Canada. In this sense, treaties don't just require time travel to the past, they also require time travel into the future. The implementation of a treaty requires us to imagine a relationship that would be very different between the settlers and Indigenous peoples than the one we've had in the history of this country. As we cast our minds back to the time of entering into the treaty, we also need to cast our minds forward to what we want the treaty relationship to look like for future generations. The knowledge about both the history and the vision for the future will always be local knowledge. It will be held by the people whose ancestors entered into the treaty and their ancestors, whose relationship with the land shaped the kinds of treaties that were acceptable to Indigenous peoples of those lands. In order to understand treaties properly, it is important to do what the Ontario courts have done in the Robinson Treaty cases, which is to listen to the people for whom the treaty is part of their history, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous treaty partners. At the same time, and here I come to my second point, aren't you lucky? We're beginning to understand that beyond the specific and the local histories of treaty, there's also a profound global history and a global future of treaty relationships. This is reflected in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Again, something that I would, if you were my class, would ask you, have you actually read it, all of it? I'll give you a little snippet. It seems impossible to read the declaration without hearing resonances of all the treaty histories that we can learn about locally. For example, in Article 37, UNDRIP affirms treaty rights. It states, and I quote, "Indigenous peoples have the right to the recognition, observance, and enforcement of treaties, agreements, and other constructive arrangements concluded with states or their successors, and to have states honor and respect such treaties, agreements, or other constructive arrangements." We are at this moment in time at the very earliest of stages in beginning to apply and understand the United Nations Declaration. But its mere existence speaks to the global impacts of colonization and a more recent global effort of decolonization. When we are trying to understand legal language that talks about rights, it is often helpful to read them sort of backwards, asking what is the wrong that is being addressed in the rights granting language. So when I look at Article 37 through this lens, I note that it reflects the history of failing to recognize, observe, and enforce treaties. The klutzy language that I just read to you of treaties, agreements, and other constructive arrangements, elegant, isn't it, speaks to the fact that governments have sometimes gone to great lengths to avoid honoring a treaty by simply declaring it not to be a treaty. For example, in the Siwi case, the government argued that the declaration by General Murray did not amount to a treaty because General Murray may not have had authority to enter into a treaty. The Hurons may not have had capacity to enter into the treaty because they were outside of their traditional territory. The document was not formal enough in its wording. There had been no exchange of wampum. The agreement did not involve the cession of land, and so on and so forth. While the Supreme Court in Siwi concluded that the Murray Declaration was a treaty, the word does not appear in the declaration, and that alone made it easier for the government to make the arguments I've just described. The wording of Article 37 of the UNDRIP demonstrates that these problems have arisen elsewhere, and that the United Nations General Assembly felt compelled to use really broad language to make it more difficult for governments to avoid their obligations on technical grounds. Similarly, Article 37 talks about states and their successors. And again, we can see in that language the difficulties that have arisen as imperial colonial governments were replaced by sovereign settler governments. For example, in the Williams Lake case in 2018, the Canadian government argued that it was not responsible for the obligations incurred and later breached by the imperial crown before British Columbia joined Confederation. Again, unsuccessfully. Finally, the reference to Article 37 to honor and respect treaties speaks to the many instances in Canada and globally when treaties were neither honored nor respected. But it also speaks to the tremendous importance of international solidarity of Indigenous peoples in affirming rights and seeking redress. Let me conclude by congratulating the parties to the Robinson-Huron Treaty who have had a successful conclusion to their settlement negotiations this past Friday. If there was ever any doubt that the Robinson Treaties are important, this $10.5 billion, that's with a B, settlement might put those questions to rest. Thank you. And I'll ask Juan to come up.
Thank you so much. Very interesting and certainly good news on Friday. I'd like to now invite Dr. Juan Sanchez Martinez. He has a PowerPoint to go with that. So Stacy will be working the Zoom, but welcome. Okay.
Good morning. Thank you, Denise, Stacy, Julia, everybody for being here. I'm going to share some ideas. I'm not a specialist in law or anything like that. I work with literatures. Yeah, that's what I do. So I'm going to share some ideas. It should work. Yes. So when I speak, wherever I am, I guess I start with the land. And I have to say that, you know, like when I think about the place where I am and the place where I am from, I think about this word that is Abya. And this is a special word that has been used for several years. It's written in different ways. Sometimes it's Abyayala, sometimes it's Abyayala, and it means land in its full maturity or land of vital blood. And yeah, it has been used since the 1970s in different realms, sometimes in the UN, sometimes in gathering of indigenous peoples. And it's a different way to understand the Americas that in my perspective is just one, it's one, you know, it's one piece of land that where indigenous peoples for thousands of years have been traveling, exchanging, celebrating, sometimes fighting, but it's all one land. And it's also a way to remember that this is not a new world. This is ancient. It's an old mother that is fertile and abundant. And so that's where I am. Yes, I agree with everybody here. You know, we are all treaty people, and I'm grateful to live and work here on Aninki Wikwit. I hope that is written well. The traditional territory of the Fort William First Nation, signatory to the Robinson Superior Treaty of 1850. I acknowledge this, and I also acknowledge that this is a place of crossing too, where a lot of indigenous peoples, First Nations are still, you know, passing through. And indigenous peoples from the south of Abya, from Africa, from Asia. And I like to think that, so I'm just here learning. I come from Muiquita, so that's the original name of Bogota, the capital of Colombia. Bogota comes from Muiquita, it becomes like Bacata, and you know, like all those changes during the colonial imposition of Spanish. And it basically means like a fertile valley in the highlands of the Andes. And today's, you know, like 10 million people, chaotic city, Latin America, but it's still an ancestral place. And I like to think that cities are ancestral places. So treaties were never signed with the Muisca peoples, the original peoples. The city grew like, I guess, given the back to the river, the Huachineque or Funza and the Tunjuelo. And it's pretty sad to see, you know, how the river has suffered these 500 years, and sometimes people are not conscious that he's there, she's there. So this is the city, and in the back you can see the mountains of Chihuachia and Teusaca. During the colonial period, you know, like these mountains became Guadalupe and Monserrate. People in the city don't remember these ancestral names of the places. The city is surrounded by many of them, like Mahui, Huayca. And so part of my work with a lot of people from my generation, and this is not academia, this is our life, is, you know, like walking with elders from other communities who still remember, so we can remember too. And these two mountains for me are protectors of Bacata, Muiquita. And beyond these mountains, there is a special ecosystem where the water comes from. And Bogota wouldn't exist without that. Most of the electricity producing in Colombia is hydroelectric dam generated. And so it's important to remember that, you know, like water is literally everything, and Bacata is surrounded by it. Recently, so this is the person, the representative from Spain, Gonzalo Jiménez de Quesada, who arrived in 1538 to Bacata. This is an statue that became like a center of a debate recently, because it was toppled by the Misak activist community. And I just wanted to show this because this is what is happening in Colombia and around the world. It's a time that these colonial histories are being questioned. And it also shows how indigenous peoples in Colombia, but all over disagree with the way how the nation states have written their history. In 1991, there is an important moment in the history of my country because it's the first time that the country recognized that we are pluriethnic and multilingual. And indigenous peoples and Afro-Colombians participated in the writing of this new constitution. So I guess that's also really important for my generation because we grew up with that consciousness. And this is Lorenzo Muelas, one of the elders who participated. He's the same community, the Misak, of the youth that fought with the conquistador, the statue. And a lot of countries in Latin America is only until the 1990s that they recognize the same. And there are still countries like Chile who are struggling in this recognition. They recently had a referendum and the country of Chile didn't pass the new constitution, where for first time it's going to be recognized multi-ethnic. So this is a long history, and I wanted to share this because, I started thinking about treaties here in Turtle Island, in the north of Abya Island. And I was thinking, what happened in Bacatá? And so what happened is that is the story of Rurmequeteba. Don Diego de Torres y Moyachoque, he is the Turmeque chief. His Memorial de Agravios is one of the first documents written by an indigenous chief to an European king, Philip II. And it's a fascinating story, that I wanted to bring because people in my own country, they forget this event, but and is really special, his battle. So the cacique was born in 1549. His father is a Spanish encomendero, Juan de Torres. His mother is a Muisca woman chief, Catalina Moyachoque. He is literate in Spanish, but he's bilingual, also in Muscubun. He's a mixed race person, and he's definitely dangerous for the colonial project. In 1575, his half-brother files a case against his right to be the Muisca chief. He is recognized by his community because the Muisca tradition is matrilineal. From 1575 until his death, his life is a long legal battle for recognition between Bogota and Madrid. He actually travels to Madrid and meets with the king, and he himself gives the document where he says what is happening with his people. And you can read some of the translation of this document, and the king finally recognizes him. He comes back to Bacatá, but the colonial power at the moment doesn't recognize that document from the king. And it shows like the contradiction between the crowns and the colonies. And how the documents speak one thing and the reality is other. So there are no treaties in this history, just racism and sexism at the foundation of what later became Colombia. Don Diego de Torres today is represented in contradictory ways. He is sometimes a mixed race rebel. He is a noble Muisca. He's an indigenous chief. Sometimes he's as assimilated Indian. And he, in himself, he's like in between. And this is I guess, the beginning of mixed race people in Colombia, like myself. So meanwhile, in Turtle Island, I didn't know, as I said before, much about treaties. I came to Canada in 2010 to study my PhD in literatures. So I was yeah, like, like just knowing and surviving the winter. But in 2012 and 2013, I attended some gatherings of the Idle No More project, a mobilization, sorry, and started listening like important facts about the history of Canada or this land. And I listen elders and professors, sharing their concerns and their perspectives about this. And it was the first time that I heard about the two-row wampum, for example. And I wanted to just mention it because it has been constantly mentioned in these gatherings and in other gatherings. And so probably you are familiar with Idle No More, but this is a movement that was that started, with 4 Indigenous women that traveled across Canada and the world, that received recognition and, and solidarity from Indigenous peoples around the world. And that, were fighting this bill that wanted to be passed by the prime minister at the time, who didn't consult the communities. And so this was the context. And one way, there are many interpretations of the two-row wampum, and it opens a door of analogies and metaphors. And what I have experienced is that is alive in the orality of many communities, principally the Haudenosaunee. And so mutual respect, peaceful coexistence, and non-interference, these are the principles at the heart of the Caswenta and the heart of many other Indigenous nations' treaty-making process. The two-row. So when I think about this, and I started to, and attending these gatherings and listening, I realized that many treaties were converging in one treaty. And this is the way how I have processed this. And is that, in one side, you have the ancestral archive, in this case, a wampum, because archives and memory are not just letters. The orality around the treaty, like the orality within the communities about these treaties, what Yula was talking about. The treaty signing as a sacred diplomacy. I remember Elder Eli Baxter in Western University talking about that. And for me, that was really special because he reminded us that, like these signings were with tobacco, were with the pipe, were with food, ceremony, the old language. And so there is an intention there that is beyond the document itself. And so that is important to remember. And the Indigenous perspective of futurity, in which our deep present reverberates toward both our ancestors and our descendants. So the idea of past and future and present, I want to think about it. And then you have the other mindset, the treating greeting with the Latin alphabet, the legal rationality around treaties, the treaty signing as a political performance, and the Western idea of history as a timeline, which I have been heard can be a trap. So I was collecting literature for this book at this time, and all these coincide, and you can read this book. It's available online, and Indigenous peoples all over the world participated. And in making this book, I met Rayen Kujeh. So now we're going to travel to Chile quickly. And this is the Kilin Koyan. the Quillín Parliament is a type of treaty. So I realized that in Latin America, the indigenous people didn't sign treaties with the crown, with the exception of the Mapuche. And so this is where we are going. And the Walmapu is the Mapudungun name for the ancestral territory of the Mapuche. Is located both in Argentina and Chile, the two sides of the Cordillera. And the Mapuche are proud to say that, they were never defeated by the crown. And Rayen Kujeh is part of this history, and she's also part of the anthology. And she was the first person who told me, Juan, like the Quillín Treaty. And why the Quillín Treaty? Well, in 1641, the Spanish crown recognized the independent Mapuche nation south of the Biobío River. The Chilean state ignored this treaty, and between 1830 and 1881 occupied the Mapuche territory, burning the rucas and crops and stealing the cattle. They called this time the Pacificación de la Araucanía, the pacification. I don't know, it doesn't make sense, eh? But there is an important division, like when you think about the history of Abya Yala, it's like one is the history when the crown was ruling, and one is the history when the nation states became independent. And sometimes what you see is this, there was recognition during the crown, and then there was another project. So all this is still alive because, like the Quillín Treaty is still being mentioned as the two-row wampum in the gatherings of the Mapuche mobilization. And so the military dictatorship of Chile was a right-wing authoritarian military regime that ruled Chile for 17 years and passed laws that, again, were attacking the collective land of the Mapuche. Until today, Chile does not recognize its diversity in the constitution. And today there are many cases of criminalization of the leaders, and specifically the machis, which are the spiritual leaders, men and women of the Mapuche. And they are using this anti-terrorist law within their own nation against their own citizens. So this is the poem that we included in this anthology of Rayen Kujeh. As I said before, I am more into poetry and songs. And so I'm just going to read it, and I would like that you think about the river, the Biobío, and the importance in this long history. The rivers flow like blood upon the earth, hauling along the dreams of my elders, the food of our freedom. That's why, Biobío, they imprison you behind a dam. Fuchaleufu, you who carries the breath of araucaria trees, you who tells Lafken Mapu stories and transmit the snow message in the weeping winter that water my siblings. That's why, Biobío, they want you, majestic river, for men do not see our history's heartbeat in your waters. They want to hull your song and silence our ancestral voices. Condors of the sun kiss your waters. My ancestors are rising up. This is Rayen Kujeh, and I remember, in these gatherings of Idle No More, that people were saying like, well, and who is speaking for the water? Who is speaking for the rivers? Like in this conversation about law, what are the original instructions? This is the conversation that has to be here too. So I guess see how's the time. I only have a few minutes. I had a long talk, but so I'm just gonna cut some part. But I wanted to say that in the last 7 years, I was living in the Anikituwagi territory among the Cherokee in the mountains of Western Carolina in Toquillas-D. And this is was a really special opportunity for me to also learn about the history of treaties in the US, which is completely different of what we are talking about here. And so this is Kituwa, the mother town, you know, like, and the history of the Mound peoples. And so what happened is that, you know, after signing these treaties with Washington, you know, like the communities in the southeast, they thought that, you know, things were going to be respectful among Washington and the communities. But it didn't happen because in the 1830s, this president, Andrew Jackson, signed this act of removal. And this is a really sad and powerful history of these communities who had to be, who were forced, displaced, you know, to the other side of the Mississippi River. And until today, you know, like this history is alive. And some communities, some families stay in the mountains, like the eastern band of the Cherokee. And this is important to remember because treaties, you know, have many faces depending where we go. And so this is Joy Harjo. It's a beautiful book. If you want to check, it's An American Sunrise. And she's talking about these events. And it shows how, you know, for indigenous people, these events are, again, alive. They are part of our stories, of our elders. And so the reason why I was talking about futurity is because, you know, reading this poetry, it reminds me that, you know, like elders have made decisions and they have signed these documents with a vision for their grandchildren, which it happens that sometimes are some of us. And so, you know, like I want to come back to that moment and that vision. And we don't have time, but I just wanted to finish with this a few words. In the Constitution Act, 1982, Section 35, we read the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada are hereby recognized and affirmed. This is not the case in other parts of the world. Today, right now, there is an opportunity in Canada, as I understand it. Renewal of a treaty relationships is very much a core aspect of Indigenous treaty making. So I really appreciate what the speakers before said, because this is constantly changing and evolving, and is related with you know, like the two parts or all the parts that are together. Treaties are not static, nor can they be unilaterally defined. They evolve and will continue to evolve for as long as the sun shines, the rivers flow, and the grass grows. This is my final thought. This gathering today is a way of renewal and an opportunity to come to one mind as a cross-cultural society. The conversation on treaties is an opportunity to imagine what kind of futurities chiefs and elders envision when signing these treaties, and what perspectives on the land guided those visions. How can we activate or redesign their wishes for the future generations? And thank you.
Thank you very much Dr. Sanchez Martinez, Juan, we call him. Uh, That was really interesting and a really nice juxtaposition of the two talks against each other to think about locally and globally what that means. I would like now to invite Elder Ron up to share a closing prayer, and then I have one little short invitation for you following that. So welcome, Elder Ron.
Miigwech, for those awesome remarks. And it's always good to hear our people that are highly educated to try put things into perspective and to help us understand how important our relationship as Indigenous people with other human beings. And I'm always in awe of feeling hopeful about that. The the idea of saying hello to all of my relations, bonjour and the dinwe makanatok, that's what that word means. We're all related, but not only as two-leggeds, we're related to everything that has spirit. Think about that. Everything that has spirit. Like when I was a little boy growing up here in Thunder Bay, teachers would tell me the closest living relative to the human beings are the chimpanzees. I go home and tell my dad, and he'd get mad at me. Years later, I found out that as Indigenous people, the closest living relatives to us are the trees. The trees. I'm sure if a chimpanzee could talk, they would say the same thing. It's not the humans we're closely related to, it's the trees. In the mid-40s, my mother, when she was a little girl, she grew up in Thunderchild First Nation, Treaty 6 territory. 1776, her ancestors entered into treaty. An old Cree man walked into the bush without any shoes or socks on, and she followed him. She was about 6 years old. She didn't know where he was going, but she could hear him crying. He was weeping as he's walking in the bush and saying in his language, "Which one of you are going to help me with my ceremony? Which one of you are going to help me with my ceremony?" He was weeping. She couldn't understand what he was crying about. And she looked, and he didn't know she was following him. And he went from tree to tree asking, "Which one of you are going to help with our ceremony?" as he's weeping. And we know today that one of the most important ceremonies of our people is the sun dance, which was banned in 1885, the year my Japan was born. My great-grandparent was born. So we suffered for so long that we didn't know why we're so connected, why Creator gave us these laws to live by. And she remembers at a young age, 6 years old, saying, if that's what religion is, then I want that, she says. That's what I want. And she got it. It wasn't too long after the priest got a hold of the young little girls and boys from Thunderchild and put them away in a residential school. For 6 years, 7 years, some of them over a decade, forgot those teachings. But she was able to have them infused to her at that moment. So when she gave them to her children, I'm the oldest of the family, I have them now. Deep convictions, strong. Bakosandan, it's hope from the treaties, from the teachings. And this is what we want to share with Canadians. This is what I want to share with people here in Thunder Bay. This is what we want our young people to learn in a good way. So I really admire these amazing speakers that we had, and it's an honor to be here. Ganamya, being the gek mashum sanak chibayak, being the gek manohaki, yijimanido, iwichwe ishanam gakana nungam, aho. That's about a prayer, a short prayer asking Creator, asking the Spirit's Mother Earth, to come here and be with us, to help us. Today is a good day. And that's what our people taught us. That's how we should treat each other. That's how we should treat everything. That's spirit, because it's respectful. Miigwech, aho.
Miigwech Elder for bringing us back together in a really good place. So I'd like to extend my thanks to everybody for joining us today. Please feel free to help yourself to some refreshments, beverages at the back if you haven't yet had a chance to. And I would like to also extend an invitation to have you join us back here again on Wednesday, November the 8th. The same place, 10:30, same time. We will be honoring and recognizing Indigenous Veterans Day at that time. And we have been working across the region with several partners to start and grow an exhibit. So we'll be setting that up, I think, tomorrow. So there'll be another Indigenous Veterans exhibit. For those who have come previous years, you'll see an extension of that. And it's one that we're growing. So we hope that you're able to join us on Wednesday. So miigwech, thank you very much. I wish you all a beautiful week. Thank you.